I'd like to introduce Chris Newsome, who's the Director of Asset Management for Anglian Water. Chris is also the Chair of the Infrastructure Working Group that sits on behalf of the UK Green Construction Board. So Chris, please come up and give us your perspective on what's been going on in the UK and also in business. Thank you, Chris. Wonderful. Thanks. Well done.
Good morning. Good morning. So the title on the screen is Reduce Carbon, Reduce Cost. And this is part personal story, it's a part business journey, and it's a part UK journey. And it kind of builds on some of the things that Agneta has just presented. I could have called this Carbon Disruptor, because carbon is a disruptor to how we design and construct infrastructure. I could even have called it a story of collaboration across the value chain. But hopefully, you'll get the picture of why all those things come out of this particular challenge. So a personal mantra of mine is begin with the end in mind. This is the end. It's the end of my first 5-year period, having said and challenged to our supply chain, we will take 50% of the embodied carbon out of the assets we build by 2015. And that statement was made as a big, hairy, audacious goal in 2009. I had a belief that in so doing, it would reduce cost, and in 90% of the circumstances, it would reduce cost. Not in every circumstance. And by going for the 90% challenge, it would mean that we had the resource, financial and intellectual, to make better and more sustainable decisions for those projects that don't follow that rule. That's the whole of my capital programme for Anglian Water in the east of England between 2010 and 2015. Not pilot projects, every single project across £2.5 billion of investment. And in the top right-hand quadrant, because I can baseline cost and I can baseline carbon at the start of every project, the top right-hand quadrant is where we want to be in that sweet spot of saving carbon and saving cost. And if you counted the dots, it's roughly about 80% that's up in that top right-hand quadrant. So Anglian Water serves the east of England. It's the fastest growing area in the country. It's the largest geographically based water company in England and Wales. It's about number 4 in terms of turnover across the UK. It's the fastest growing. It's dry and getting drier. Our rainfall is similar to Jerusalem. It's stormy in the summer, getting stormier, and 28% of our land lies below sea level. 28% of my £50 billion gross value of assets lie below sea level. So if there was a company out there dealing with that perfect storm of energy, water and food, then Anglian Water lives firmly in that region between the Thames and London, the Humber and Yorkshire, and the East Coast and the middle of the country. So there's no point in looking at the rest of the water industry in 2009 for the way forward. We had to look much, much wider. And we looked at brand leaders like Unilever and Marks and Spencer's to set out our strategy of how we would deal with this particular challenge. And hence being bold, plan A, Marks and Spencer's, nail your colours to the mast and say exactly what you're going to do and be prepared to report against that and report your successes. It means that there can be no U-turn once you've set out in the strategy of reducing carbon. So I've got a couple of slides now about belief. So this is very simple for me. Somebody once told me, a group of experts once told me, it was 2008, that 80% of my carbon sat in the concrete and the steel that I was using. In a 1-hour presentation, they then took the next 59 minutes to tell me all the things they didn't know about where the 20% was, and it would take 20 years to find that out. And I thanked them at that point at the end of the presentation. 99% of the people had heard it would take 20 years to solve it. I heard the first minute that said we know where 80% of it is. Now let's start dealing with that now. I mentioned the 90% rule, that if this is about natural resource and processing of natural resource, which is where the carbon comes from in construction, then if we can use less natural resource, we can save cost, we can save carbon. And I came up with a 90% rule, which was where I kept the focus within our business. When people asked the challenge, even Prince Charles asked in 2010, how much is this going to cost you to save this carbon? No, sir, you don't understand. This is going to save money. So how would we achieve this? Well, below ground, we'd stop digging and we'd insert pipe through no-dig technologies. And above ground, how would we do this? Well, either we'd reuse and optimize our existing assets and relife those assets, or we'd move into that brave new world of lean construction, build off-site using new materials, using less materials, etc. And when we'd done that, we had a strategy. And remember what I said about no U-turn. So in the no U-turn, the belligerence is really, really important. So we can model it, we can baseline it. We have the tools to know where the carbon is, and we have the tools to tell us the kind of solutions that we should be going for to achieve 50% plus carbon reduction. The belligerence comes in the governance. The governance has to be bold enough when you have a process like that to say, thank you, but you still haven't achieved the outcome. And if you send the team back to find the outcome, then magic can and does happen. And finally, you need some kind of mantra out there. So, do we need to build at all? If so, can we, if not, if we do need to build, can we build lean? If no, we can't build lean, then can we build with materials that have less carbon in that? And if we can't build with materials that have less carbon in, can we use existing materials but use less of them? And those were the kind of mantras that we ran with within our business. In 2005, 95% of the underground assets that we replaced or laid were done through open cut. And people at that stage thought that the answer lay in the materials, and particularly in the pipe materials. When you actually understand carbon and build models that describe where your carbon is, actually we understood that in some instances only 12% of the carbon was in the pipe, the rest was in the construction techniques. So by late 2015, 90% of the pipe that we were putting in the ground or the sewer was actually being done through no-dig technologies. Many of those technologies existed before we started this journey, but the challenge drove the innovation, it drove the transformation. You'll notice there that it's come back to 75%. I put a 75% on there, because in some circumstances, we now understand that actually it is cheaper to do an open cut with narrow trenching and use something called MOPV pipe. And that's an innovation in its own right. On the above ground, taking the first steps, and I talked about the challenge of reusing and relifing assets. This is a snippet of a 30,000 population equivalent extension to a large sewage treatment works in Bedfordshire. The original team came forward in November 2010, so this is 7 months after we'd said we will be taking 50% of the carbon out, with an answer that saw a reduction from £24 million to £17 million. It saw an OPEX reduction in the assets we were building, but it did not see the answer to the carbon challenge. We were still at something like only a 30% reduction. And this is the first team that did it to themselves. They didn't come forward through the governance and try and argue their case. They said, sorry, this isn't good enough. There's no point in going to him for him to tell me that this isn't good enough. We will now go and look again at the solution. And when they did, they found that the answer lay in the existing assets, in making the existing assets more efficient. And when they did that, the 17 million, which had already fallen down from 24, became 14 million. The OPEX, the operating expenditure on the site, reduced even though we had 30,000 more population connected, and the carbon fell through the floor. We were at 65% carbon reduction. The message there is The process and the belligerence drives the outcome. I remember I said that this isn't just about real-lifing assets, this is also building new assets. And we came up with the concept of parts, components, assemblies, and whole assets. And we started creating assets and parts that were carbon friendly, so that in essence we had a pick and drop scenario, being able to pluck assets that were low in carbon and low in cost, and to create whole assemblies and whole assets from that. You might see where this is going, because this is very much in that BIM territory, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So between 2010 and 2015, these are our success stories. Remember the graph I first showed you? That top right-hand quadrant was equivalent to 45% on average across the whole program carbon reduction, and a 23% reduction in cost. So if there's any FDs in the room doubting whether this is the right thing to do, then that is absolutely the myth buster. In the final year of that 5-year period, we actually hit 54%. Remember, the challenge was 50%. But if I'd really understood the scenario about where we were as a universe, as a country, at the time of claiming a 50% reduction in 2009, I would have gone for something much bigger. Remember the surrogate of natural resource being a surrogate for carbon and vice versa? Well, if we as the UK are using 3.5 times our entitlement to natural resource, we're probably driving 3.5 times our carbon. So in reality, my 50% should have been 72%, which is rather close to an 80% number that's now being talked about. So moving on to post-2015, and concrete has already been mentioned. So 2010-2015 was about using less concrete and using less steel. But what does that do to a supply chain that actually makes concrete and creates cement? 2013-14 was the first time somebody came knocking on our door and said, "You're the company that is using less concrete. Can we convince you to change? We have a cement-free concrete." Between 2014 and 2017, another 5 companies have come knocking on the door saying, "We too can do CEM-free concrete, low carbon." That's the power of sticking hard to the goals and the supply chain then being encouraged to follow. Of course, we now need to be bold enough, and the collaboration point has already been made, to reflect that in Eurocodes so that we understand where to use this, not just in general concrete terms, but in structural concrete terms. I said I'd also come back to the world of digital enablement. So in 2014, all those parts, all those assemblies created a water treatment works that looked like the top left-hand box. Quite radically different to some of the water treatment works that I would have been building only 2-3 years earlier. When we built that, we only had a 46% reduction on embodied carbon. And the engineers said, "Ain't good enough." Where did we lose it? Because we're as lean as we can be in the above ground, and because they had that as a digital portrayal, somebody flipped it. They turned it upside down, and they said, "That's where your carbon is. We're still traditional, we're still burying pipes under the ground. In reality, all we need is drainage, because water still flows downhill in drains, actually." So when we came to build the next one and the next generation, look at the difference between the amount that was underground in 2014 and underground in 2017. So this is my kind of culmination and bringing up to date the story within Anglian Water. And this scheme won the British Construction Industry Awards for carbon reduction last year. It also won the Utility Awards for carbon reduction. Why? Because it's the kind of culmination of all the things I've just been talking about and hinting at. And this is one of these things that could never be done. So this is a new large diameter cross-country pipeline connecting 2 of our major sources in the east of England, for resilience. The fact is there was already a pipeline. It already flowed in one particular direction. What if we could slow that water down, turn it round, make the booster stations bidirectional, and create a little bit of storage on one end of it to give us time to do that? How much carbon and how much cost would that save if we didn't have to build that new pipeline? And that's the answer. 62 million down to 30 million, and 16,000 and some tons of CO2 saved, because the challenge was there, it was writ large, and we weren't about to move backwards in that challenge. Moving on now to the national level. So I've talked about a bit of a personal journey, I've talked about an Anglian water journey in terms of reducing carbon, and this is where the national piece picks up. So in 2010-11, I was invited to join a group of the Institution of Civil Engineers and Her Majesty's Treasury, looking at the cost of construction in the UK. And about a year later, I was asked to join the Green Construction Board and to lead the infrastructure group on that board. We learned from how that document had been produced and the kind of messages it was talking about. And guess what? The first document was talking about procurement, it was talking about leadership, and it was talking about innovation. So when we came to create the Green Construction Board, we came up with a route map, top right. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? We called it the fundamental truths. We came up with an infrastructure carbon review as a sister document to that cost of construction. And guess what it says? Leadership, procurement, and innovation, absolutely key to driving the carbon agenda. And once we'd done that and we got people signing up to that, and our list is very similar to your list of companies signing up to these things, people start asking the question, what does that mean for us? How do we go on this journey of carbon reduction? And that's when PAS 2080, the first available specification for measuring and driving carbon reduction, was created. That document is a British standards document. It's set out in a certain way and is required to be set out in a certain way, but it has an associated document, which is the guidance document, which tells practitioners like you and I how you go on a journey like this, how you measure carbon, how you decide how to do some of those things that leaders, procurers, and innovators do. We've gone on to create a freely available e-learning module to help the process. And one of the things that we were talking about yesterday before the conference started, wouldn't this be good if we had some 80-20 principles about science-based targets? So it wasn't about what do I think the target should be as Anglian Water or a leader within industry and going 50%, 6% or whatever. They are recognizable targets that are the best available at the moment, but not necessarily as precise as they may be as science develops its theories over the next 5, 10, or 15 years. Oops. Oh, that's interesting. That's flipped round over the one that I've got. So these are the, this is the message about leaders determining the real solutions. These are leaders that signed up. I've got the logos, not just the lists. But PAS 2080 is designed to work at all levels. So if you are a plant supplier, then you may get PAS 2080 accreditation. If you are a product supplier, you may get PAS 2080 accreditation. If you are a constructor, and Skanska is the first one to get PAS 2080 accreditation, then you may also get that accreditation. If you are a client, Anglian Water, you may get accreditation. If you're the client determining that future, how much more powerful? Remember the diagram that Paul first showed that shows the ability to influence carbon degrades over time as you get further down that supply chain. So how much more important is it for the client or government to be in the driving seat of saying how we will reduce that carbon. And this is our certificate. This is Anglian Water's accreditation. Just to show that it hasn't stopped within my business, the 50% reduction is now a 60% challenge, with even more of the schemes post-2015 in that top right-hand box. And we too, as a company, have taken that carbon neutral challenge. Sweden 2045, maybe I need to go and give ourselves a kick when I get back, because that says 2050. It's obviously the wrong answer. And then finally, back to any FDs in the room?
Financial directors.
Any financial directors in the room? Anybody with financial responsibilities in the room? Oh dear. Because this is where the power is. So I've talked about cost reduction, but if you are a company like mine that has to raise debt to fund its projects, going down the route that we've gone and getting that accreditation opened up a whole new market for raising debt more cheaply, more cost effectively. We're the first utility in Europe to have a green bond funded through the London Stock Exchange. That means my debt is so much more cheaper because of the process and the route that I've been down. So this is where carbon meets cost and happily coincides within business. Thank you very much.